Tarell Alvin McCraney, and today I just wanted to talk to you all a little bit about the Baroque period in terms of theater and how it's shaped. But in order to really talk about that, really explore it, we've got to talk about the Renaissance period, which came right before. During that period of time, 1400s into the early 1600s, we find that Europe is undergoing a shift, a change. The Dead Sea Scrolls have been discovered, the proliferation of thought, learning, and a resurgence, renaissance of the classical way of thinking, classical way of creating art. We often don't talk about economically what's happened during this time. This is a period when right before this, the world has sort of stagnated in terms of economic growth. But then this something happened, this discovery of the new world, or this race to find a trade route, open up the global market, as it were, became so intense and so heightened that an admiral who had been a drunk before and found his way in opposite places found himself in what he thought were the East Indies. And we all know him as Christopher Columbus, and thus began the spread and trade of the open market into the New World. Now that's all boring, because we all know that. But what does that have to do with art? Well, during this time, it began to create an economic boom for the European countries that were involved. Some of that was through trading of things like chocolate and cocoa and wood and corn and cotton and things found in the New World. Some of that also invited the use of slaves, and the slave trade began to boom in this era as well. And so companies that had invested in this trade began to also invest in slavery. So with a mercantile class, and the crowns beginning to make more money and become economically stable in Europe, there became a period, this Baroque period, where people had more time on their hands. They had more chances to think, to reason. They had more chances to create more ornate forms of music, theater, and practice. But everybody didn't or wasn't necessarily at peace with what was happening in the world in order to make this period sustainable. People were, if we look at Shakespeare's work during that time, in the 1600s, it's all about ships, maritime life. People going to places, seeing new things, talking about the people there. He references the accounts that sailors do. So he's clearly listening to the sailors coming back who have sailed across the Atlantic and talking about the new people that they're meeting. Make the stories that they make up, the tales of harrowing monsters and deathly storms. One of his most famous pieces, and I think probably one of the last pieces that he created, The Tempest, is literally called The Storm, and is about colonial life, where a group of Europeans come to an island and basically enslave the inhabitants there to do what they do their bidding. Now, there are other portions of that story about the riches of the island, the beauty of the island. There's a love story buried in it. And so these sort of ornate stories are coming out because the world is engaged in an incredibly taut and terrifying economic, social, cultural exchange. There is a slave trade happening from the African coasts into the Caribbean, but also that triangulation stops at Liverpool, in Spain, and France, and into what we think of as the United States eventually, as Jamestown was created in 1601, I believe 1601 or 1607. Again, that's important to note because there were people who were, quote unquote, against the slave trade, but the economic power of it is so dominating at this time that it begins to dwindle those voices at this period and doesn't sort of gain any momentum until the 1700s, after the Baroque period ends. And a part of that is because the economic stimulus that is happening through the slave trade is making a certain class very wealthy and another class not. So we see the things like the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution all happening in the 3 quadrants of that slave trade, happening because there is a sustained amount of period, 100 years of watching the wealth from this global market sustain only one sector, and you know, during that time they go in, the kings, Louis XIV, King George, his son Charles, they all are finding these opulent ways to make music. They're living in these palaces. They're funding artists. They're becoming patrons. Shakespeare's invited before to come to the palace often and create these wonderful, beautiful plays. Meantime, the rest of the world is in this cultural exchange that we will forever be ironing out. We see how in Liverpool, for example, there are remnants of the slave trade. Liverpool, I believe, has the oldest black population in England, and we watch as how this stew gets turned up and around, and how now the deposits of it, the seeds of that, are beginning to play out. And all of this was happening during this sort of Baroque period, which some of us can think of as boring, but this ornate kind of intricate, detailed period of time. And watching those seeds come to fruition now is important because we're still engaged in the kind of global market. We're still engaged in trying to figure out how economies can grow at a global reach, but also still involved in amazing wealth distribution inequality. That's all very political, and I'm sure you all are sort of sitting there thinking, why are we talking politically when we're supposed to be talking about art? But those things inform art. You can always tell that during the times that a period is called golden, or something is called the Gilded Era, or an era is called the Age of Enlightenment, that there is another portion, there's another place or another period of time that is underpropping those actions. So while Louis XIV was dancing in his court, there were slaves in Hispaniola working on his behalf. And it's always important to remember that. It's always important to remember the counterbalance. Because as the Baroque period tells us, there's a phonic counterpoint to all the language, to all the balance. Even in the paintings you can see it. And it's important to think about that in terms of the social environment that was happening in.